So assalamu alaikum everyone. We're going to make a start. So welcome to the Islam and AI Research Group session. So this is the second session. So the aim of the research group is to be part of the active intellectual debate on AI by defining the right questions at the interface of Islam and AI, producing scholarly work and organizing seminars and conferences. We hope to educate ourselves about AI without underestimating AI's capabilities, explore what it means, how to be human and Muslims in the age of AI without underestimating the capabilities of human beings based on an Islamic worldview. This is not an anti-AI group. AI is a reality, and our goal is to define how to embrace progress while maintaining our God-centered mission on Earth, as defined by an Islamic worldview based on principles like truth, justice, and preserving the dignity of all human beings. So here are some organizational details. So we have the website of our research group here. So it's still under construction, but we'll probably share the link a bit later if you don't get it down in time. And then if you want more updates on our research group, then please fill in there's a form to join our WhatsApp community. We also hope to have in-person and online reading groups, as well as online seminars in the near future. So please join the mailing list or WhatsApp community group for updates. Our YouTube channel is linked here, and Discord channel is there. As always, we're open to comments, suggestions that will help to improve the research group. So always feel free to reach out to us with those improvements. So the structure for today is, so we're going to first start off with a talk for about an hour from 11 till 12 by Dr. Amina Inloes. And then we'll have a break from 12 to 1:30, and then at 1:30 we'll reconvene and we'll have a workshop and brainstorming session aimed at laying the groundwork for current and future initiatives within the MRI's Islam and AI initiative. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Amina Inloes. So she is a lecturer in Islamic Studies at the Islamic College in London. She has a PhD from the University of Exeter, focusing on Hadith. She is the author of Women in Shi'ism, Ancient Stories, Modern Ideologies, and has translated books on exegesis and Islamic spirituality. Her research interests include Islam and modernity, Islam and gender, and esoteric spirituality. She has 4 papers coming out on AI and Islam. These are Artificial Intelligence and Islam, Who's Not, in brackets, Afraid of ChatGPT, which is a book chapter. Robo Sheikhs, Can Artificial Intelligence Derive Fatwas? A 12 Shi'i View, Al-Khalam Journal, the Golem, the Djinni, and ChatGPT, Artificial Intelligence and Islamicate Occultism in Theology and Science, and then the final one is Artificial Intelligence and Islamic Theology, an interview with ChatGPT. So please welcome me in welcoming Dr. Amina Inloes.
Thank you very much. And it's nice to see you. Greetings to people in the online and virtual world as well. This is not boding well for my ability to speak about technology. Are we screen sharing now? Yes. Alhamdulillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Guys, this is the Muslim Research Network. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about a few philosophical, theological, and conceptual questions regarding artificial intelligence and theology/metaphysics. This is not a technical talk, and I do understand that all of us are coming here with different types of expertise, both scientific and technical and theological. The same with all of you in the virtual world. I don't wish to neglect you. So I know all of us are bringing our own perspectives to this issue, and I hope this can spark some interesting discussion or thought. My goal today is not to hammer in one specific perspective, but rather I'd like to call attention to some of the underlying paradigms of thought that are involved in some popular, but even also academic discussions, as well as Islamic scholarly and in other faiths, other theological discussions about artificial intelligence. So basically, I just want to point out some things that might lead to greater critical thinking about what's going on with people, whether it's the mass media, whether it's an academic journal, and so forth. And also, conversely, thinking about these things does help us to think critically about the paradigms we inherit and take for granted too. Artificial intelligence is interesting from a theological/philosophical perspective because it does challenge some inherited paradigms. I'm not necessarily saying from an Islamic perspective that it challenges the core of Islamic theology, because I don't think it does, but it does call certain ideas and assumptions into question that we might have picked up, say, from the medieval era, a couple of which I will mention today, inshallah. This is a balance. This is me reminding myself that I am trying to balance the fact that on one hand, like all of you, I have views, some of them strongly held, about this or other subjects, while on the other hand, I know that there are other views in existence. And this seems to be a truism when we talk about artificial intelligence, whether it's in a religious context or a secular context. And it's not only true with respect to consciousness, but stances on artificial intelligence in general typically reflect the preconceptions of the observer. So if you think it's impossible for artificial intelligence to ever have any form of genuine knowledge or consciousness or a soul, because humans have souls, then that is likely to color your viewpoint. If you're coming from maybe a more animist perspective and everything has consciousness and a soul, or panpsychism and that sort of thing, then probably this would be embraced fairly easily. And of course, there's all sorts of viewpoints in between. And of course, this is true for myself as well. But it is good to reflect on how what we are bringing to the discussion does affect our viewpoints about what is or is possible. And this is one reason I'm not going to be weighing in on questions like, can it be conscious and have a soul and genuinely know and so forth, except with respect to how that ties into what we're talking about today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up 4 points that I hope can shed some light on the dialogue we are having today. Now, this first one is not at all meant to be, it's not meant to be offensive. We do have a reverend in the audience here. And it's not meant to be exclusionary, but it's something I've started to notice in some higher level Muslim discussions about artificial intelligence in the English language world specifically. I'm not talking about like Saudi Arabia or a country that's not primarily English language based. That is, Christian theological views about artificial intelligence can spark new ideas with respect to Islamic thought. They can be quite interesting. There's a lot more written theologically about artificial intelligence by Christians. I particularly like the work of Marius Dorobantu. You can look him up online. But they don't necessarily match views that one might deduce from Islamic sources and ideas, because although there are similarities between Christianity and Islam, there are also significant differences. And this is not only with respect to religious or theological matters, but also we here, we're in the United Kingdom, by the way, for those online. I assume you all know we're in the United Kingdom. This culture has been heavily influenced by 2 strands of thought. I'm going to say the Judeo-Christian tradition, just because a number of people who started to theorize about artificial intelligence were Jewish. But definitely there is a Christian theological influence historically and culturally, and also due to the way the West was constructed. and probably also the Christian heritage, bringing in the ancient Greek heritage as well. So these are two cultural strands that have affected ideas about artificial intelligence, and we've seen that throughout the 20th century. It's not just something new. In contrast, these ideas are not necessarily as common, or really, if you can say, native or indigenous to Islamic thought, although they're worth considering. But my point is they are different. And one of the ways this does come up, in my view, is the sort of immediate backlash we see in the media to a sort of terror of artificial intelligence as the great demon of the end times or something. Now, of course, there are genuine, practical, real fears about artificial intelligence. Warfare, I think, is a immediate one. I don't mean killer robots taking over the world, but being used in warfare, that's something we are aware of that goes on. And there are many ways that artificial intelligence is misused to promote human inequity. Nonetheless, with respect to the fear narrative that we oftentimes get in the media, there are cultural roots of this that I would like, cultural and religious roots, I'm going to use those a bit interchangeably, that I would like to call attention to and just think about whether or not they are something we wish to replicate. Primarily, it seems, and these are not my ideas, they've been floating around the 20th century, that the fear of artificial intelligence, when we see article titles about summoning the demon for artificial intelligence and so forth, is based on a few inherited paradigms. One of them is a fear of idolatry. And if you don't believe that's a cultural/religious concern about artificial intelligence, feel free to Google idolatry and artificial intelligence, and you will find loads of stuff. Now, one might argue, well, Muslims care about idolatry too. The Quran does reject idolatry. For various reasons, Muslims do not seem to be concerned that if I've got a bot doing something on my phone, this is metaphorically the same as idolatry. Or if I have a fatwa robot, it's conceptually related to idolatry, either in a literal sense, like a speaking statue, or maybe a more metaphorical sense, artificial intelligence serving the interests of corporations and so forth. And I think there are reasons for that, which I won't go into right now. But the point is, this is something that is, if you will, under the iceberg, under the surface, that is leading to this fear narrative. Another thing we take from ancient Greece here is the fear of hubris, the idea that taking on the roles of the gods, becoming gods, overshooting, leads to destruction. This is something which has been culturally inherited and reinforced in literature. If we all studied literature in school here, right, when we were paying attention in our English classes and our literature classes, we would have encountered this idea, especially in ancient Greek drama in translation, or maybe even not in translation with some of you. But again, this hasn't been influential in the Islamic heritage. There is more the idea that Allah controls everything, so you don't have hubris because you can't ever get close to Allah. Also, there are some cultural/religious paradigms. I mean, some people do identify them as general Indo-European paradigms. So, and I'm not necessarily saying they're of a religious origin, but they do both inform the cultural products, and by extension, popular culture, like films and books and so forth. And that is the idea of separating things into good versus evil. We see this all the time, like the Lord of the Rings. Speaking of people having their invisibility rings on in here, Frodo is good, Mordor is an evil place. So there isn't sort of an in-between, and there is a cultural tendency to frame things as a battle between good or evil. And we do see in a lot of the media about artificial intelligence that it does portray it either as something that's going to save the world and we're all going to become, or some of us will become transhuman, or will outlive death, it will save the world, or else it's going to destroy us, it's going to bring about this great apocalypse, and we're going to have Terminators running around and so forth. Whereas, of course, what's likely to happen is somewhere in between. It will probably be a tool. Unfortunately, one of the things we do take from historical speculation about robots and automated machines and so forth, is it does tend to be conceived of as something that supports the interests of the elite. So unfortunately, that is probably something that will continue to happen, but not necessarily in terms of a dramatic battle between good and evil. These are ideas that underpin a lot of the things that go around about artificial intelligence. And then there are some religious considerations which aren't necessarily shared by a literal reading of Islam. Both Muslims and Christians treat humans as central to earth, but the way that is done is somewhat different. And also, I think just in general, in terms of secular Europe, there is a fear of religion being outmoded, not as much mass interest in religion. So the idea that science and technology might be replacing religion might be another sort of fear in the culture. Whereas we don't see that for whatever reason in as much of the Muslim majority world. Islam is still quite strong. I'm not saying that's always the case, but by and large, many young people do adhere to Islam. So all of this is in addition to what I would call practical hopes and fears, warfare, digital colonialism, enriching the rich, spying, whatever it happens to be. But that's somewhat different from the more dramatic pictures that we see. So my goal here is just to point out these things happen. So read critically about what you are reading. Now, if you agree with some of these, what do you call them? Paradigms, that's fine. You're reading them critically and agreeing, but just be aware of them. Okay, my next point, we were actually getting towards the issue in the title here, is that when we ask speculative questions, because right now we're talking about, artificial general intelligence and so forth, it's still largely speculative. They oftentimes say more about us now than what might actually happen in the future. The same thing with science fiction. Star Trek is very much about what was going on, say, in the 20th century, or with the newer series, the 21st century, rather than necessarily what was going on at Starfleet headquarters at some time in the future. Yes, meet the fatwa robot. Well, this robot is not expected to do ijtihad or to produce new fatwas or understandings of Islam, but nonetheless, it is a reminder that this technology is being integrated both in religious practice, but also increasingly in religious research. I would say, I mean, most, qualify that, I'm not sure if it's most. Some Muslim scholars, at least, make use of helper software, for example. I certainly use that sort of thing just to deal with hadith and databases and so forth. People use it for manuscript research, and now it is being explored for deriving fatwas. So that is something that is going on right now among people who have access to it. So that's why I'm not going to say most, because not everyone might have access to it, but it is something that is in practice being done as a specialist tool, just like it's used in medicine and so forth. But can artificial intelligence actually authentically produce Islamic rulings? I'm not going to give you an answer right now necessarily, in part because whether it can depends on whether it's accepted. That's, when it comes down to it, that's how it works. If someone accepts it, then it would be done. And if someone doesn't accept it, it would not be done. I think most Muslims would not accept it primarily, that they would accept it as a helper tool. Nonetheless, there are a few things to consider that also shed light on our situation right now. One of the things is with respect to what it means to know and what is the intellect. Classically, and this is a generalization, it's a more based in Islamic philosophy and thought, but classically the intellect was not just a machine. It was something that had a metaphysical reality. It involved spiritual truths and perceptions. It would lead you to recognizing God, to recognizing truths about God, sort of transcending the material world, if you will. And also it would recognize ethical truths. So the most intelligent person was also the closest to God and the most ethical. That's been lost to some degree in modernity, where now there is a view of the brain as a physical means of knowing among some people. I mean, perhaps we're moving beyond that currently, but there was that idea that it's just something that happens with neurons and chemical reactions and so forth. And knowledge is a material or quantifiable sort of thing. And we've tried to quantify that in our time. So for example, IQs have been measured, we get exam marks, we get degrees. There are various ways in which our knowledge is measured or our intellect is measured in linear ways. So if you will, this is a materialist view of knowledge and knowing. And the idea of knowing more is you somehow input more into your brain. So if you study 3 hours, you get 3 hours of input. Whereas a more traditional view, if you will, is that to learn also involves some divine grace. And there's a sort of divine light or connection that links you to what you are learning. It's not just me inputting books on my Kindle and then increasing my database. So I would suspect many Muslims today kind of blend these sort of ideas and may use them in different circumstances. Nonetheless, because most of us are, especially if we are university graduates, we are plugged into the global academic culture, which does tend to take a more secular view of knowledge. We do tend to treat knowledge as a thing and the brain as the processor, not the soul, for example. We don't get up in the university and say, I'm doing my PhD in chemistry because my soul knows about chemistry. That's not usually how we see things. So by extension, if knowledge is a thing and the brain is a processor, there's absolutely no reason why a computer or a program can't do that. I mean, yes, we are understanding now that artificial intelligence is not simply a copycat brain and it is doing something else. But nonetheless, from a conceptual level, there's no, if that's what knowledge is, there's no reason why a fatwa robot could not do ijtihad better, because it's not going to have, I was going to say it's not going to have biases, but of course we're finding all sorts of biases in these sorts of things. But let's assume we could construct it with the right sort of biases at any rate. But my point is, if that's how you see knowledge and knowing, which has become common, then there isn't really a difference between a human and a machine. And if that's uncomfortable, then maybe we need to revisit our assumptions about what it means to know and maybe challenge some of the materialist ideas about knowledge that have come forward. Okay, the next one is probably going to raise hackles, but it's about the idea of Islam as a perfect system. I've looked for the origin of this idea. It seems to have been around for a while. But of course, it was popularized by 20th century Islamic reformist movements. But the basic idea for anyone who hasn't come across it is that Islam is a perfect system that will create a perfect society and a perfect life and hereafter. And we just need to get things right. So for example, we've got with respect to Islamic law, we've got a Islamic law machine. We put in the right input, which is like the Quran, the Hadith, whatever, usul fiqh. And, this may have been done in the past, but the right stuff is put in. So if you put in authentic Hadith, it's good. It gets processed somehow, or it was processed at some time. And then you get your output Islamic law. And if you follow it, everything will go well in your life and in society. So perfect system. Everyone knows their job and does it, and everything works perfectly. That's very appealing. And I would say many Muslims treat that as an article of belief. At some point in time, I was also taught it as an article of belief. But the extension of that is if Islam is systematized, if you will, and if it's mechanized, then again, there's no reason a machine can't do that processing, because this is a more perfect system right here that's broadcasting me on Zoom than me. I'm a little bit of an imperfect system. My blood sugar goes up and down. I get emotions. I get tired. So again, if by extension we're uncomfortable with the final result, which is a machine would be a better Muslim scholar, then maybe it's time to look at the paradigm. Maybe Islam is something other than a system, or maybe there's more going on than just putting in the correct input into the Islamic law machine and expecting everything to be right when the output comes out. So these are all pieces of food for thought. Okay, the next one, which is also disturbing to some people, which is why the last time I was talking about it, I tried to be vague and a little bit cryptic about it. But in any case, it has occurred to me that many of our traditional ways of coming up with fatwas are very procedural. That is the idea. It's supposed to be a procedure. Now, some people might say, well, there's a divine hand or again, divine grace, but there's no reason to exclude machines from that. Allah can influence my iPhone or my Facebook feed or my email, whatever, just as well as Allah can influence me. But again, if you are taking a very traditional and literalist reading of the texts, that is quite easy, comparatively speaking, for a program or a machine to do because it's algorithmic. However, if we are looking at some of the more quote unquote reformist approaches to Islamic law, so for example, taking into consideration social contextualization, was this intended for one time or for all time or for all peoples, the intent of the law, and this sort of nuance, it's much more difficult for machines to do that. And I'm not trying to be reductionist. I understand many things come up when we talk about what Islam says or requires, but I do find it interesting that although traditionally we have this more spiritual view of the intellect and knowing, the procedure for making Islamic law is at least theoretically more algorithmic and hence more replicable by a machine. But when we get to more modern viewpoints and approaches, reformist approaches, if you will, or 20th century approaches, although these are oftentimes rooted in the social sciences and secular approaches to the world, they are nonetheless more difficult for machines to do. I think that's interesting. I'm just going to let you all chew on that. And lastly, this has been our trend in life. This is part of Dreyfus's internet book, Understanding the Internet, something like that. And it's also been observed about Islamic scholarship too, that we've undergone a trajectory. Once upon a time, which was basically before the 20th century, there was a small group of ulama, so there was a control of knowledge. Many people weren't highly educated, but there was also a strong human dimension. It was a person-to-person thing. If I give you ijaza, it's a person-to-person chain linking you to the tradition. This has basically evolved largely to a greater democratization of knowledge. Now it's not only people who have received this person-to-person training who feel like they have a right to have opinions about what Islam says, but we expect this knowledge to be available to everyone. We expect it to be transparent. We expect to be able to discuss it and think about it critically. And nowadays, the sources, of course, are much more available, both in terms of just mass literacy and what you need conceptually to deal with it, but also literally available, especially once the internet came out and it wasn't possible to censor books in various countries. And this, of course, goes hand in hand with the institutionalization of education, mass public education. So instead of knowledge being a person-to-person thing, whether it's among Islamic scholars or at the university and so forth, we now have the sort of factory level education where we pack everyone into a big lecture hall like this and impart the knowledge to go in their brain databases. So the person-to-person aspect has been lost in that regard. Since then, and especially since the pandemic, we've moved a bit more towards online education, and Islamic scholarship is no different. There are plenty of Islamic scholarly training programs which run online, which may still have a person-to-person aspect, sort of on a meta level, if you will, but it's not the same as spending many years with your teacher and being a sort of apprentice, or them being as a sort of substitute parent for you. So the digitization of that. So if, again, we continue that trajectory, it does seem reasonable that since the person-to-person element has been reduced throughout this, dehumanization could possibly be the next step. Now, is that what we want? Is that what's desirable? Is that compatible with the tradition? Does it matter? Is that the will and plan of Allah? I'll leave that to you. I'm just putting that out there. So all of these things can feed into the question of whether programs, machines, and robots can genuinely deduce Islamic law or the teachings of Islam. And of course, there's some ways in which we are strongly invested in technology as Muslims and even rely on it. I went into a room last week and a couple people were having a disagreement. They were Muslims and they said, oh, Amina's here. She can settle our argument. I'm like, great. What is it? Like, what exciting question do we have here? You know, it's like some kind of paradox or something. And what had happened is their qibla finders were giving them different qiblas and they wanted a third party to decide which way the qibla is. So we do trust these things. Many Muslims will Google aspects of Islamic law or what Islam says or the Quran and so forth. So whether or not we agree that we should be trusting this sort of technology, and especially something like Google, you know, can be said to have, I mean, I'm not speaking about Google itself necessarily, but there are many agendas, players, and interests behind how these things work. Nonetheless, it is happening in practice. Okay, third issue, artificial intelligence. Now, before I had words like strong and general and sentient and conscious, but I've deleted that. I think we're already here now with respect to artificial intelligence and digital things in general. It challenges some pre-modern and even modern Islamic paradigms of thought, but not the core principles of Islamic theology. So these are some of the ideas which we may or may not think about that have informed some traditional Muslim scholarship that we now have to jettison, in my opinion. Not everyone's going to agree. I had a great argument with a sheikh a while back who felt that artificial intelligence is a solid because the world is comprised of solids, plants, animals, humans, and metaphysical beings like angels. And it's not an animal, it's not a plant, so it's a solid, right? But of course, solids don't tend to talk about literature and write stories and, you know, chat for extensive periods of time. So they don't do math. So I don't agree with classifying it as a solid. But that does bring up the question of what some people have termed the great chain of being, which is an idea found in some ways in medieval Islamic thought and in some ways in medieval European thought, and still sometimes exists as part of the general idea of Islam relating to a systematic and orderly view of humanity and the cosmos. Of course, if anything can be said about modernity and post-modernity, we've lost so many systematic orders, but nonetheless, you know, there is an idea that there's a hierarchy of existence. So, you know, you have a rock and then you have a tree, and the tree is existentially superior to the rock, and then the animal is more superior, and the human is, you know, the most superior in terms of earthly beings, and then you have the angels and so forth. So everything has a hierarchical, vertical relationship in the line of creation. And this idea does still inform contemporary scholarship. This is a comment, you know, just treated as a true statement by a 20th century Islamic scholar. It is comforting to think that everything has a place. Now, there are ways that this idea has been misused historically, you know, but just taking types of things in a certain order. And it's nice to think of things like that. But the problem is digital things, including artificial intelligence, don't fit anywhere in this neat order. They seem to challenge it. As I mentioned, you know, something like ChatGPT, it's not any of these things. It may be better at some things than I am, just like sheer mass data processing and speaking lots of languages. But of course, it's inferior in other ways, and there's many things it can't do. So most likely, this is one of the paradigms that will not survive the artificial intelligence era, except for people who are very, very resistant and in denial. And that's okay. The Quran does not necessitate this. The Hadith do not necessitate this. This is more of a philosophical construction. And some constructions, you know, they have their time and they go, like geocentrism. It was influential, you know, now it's gone and been replaced by a new view of the universe. Another is the idea of celebrating the human as the speaking / rational animal, insan natiq. Now, we can argue about what that means, but at the very least, we can include logic, reason, and speech. And of course, this is again another philosophical inheritance from the ancient Greek tradition. It's not specified by the Quran and Hadith. Of course, this is a bit more of a cynical view about what it means to be a rational animal. But that worked for a long time because house cats weren't quite as rational, and my pet birds are not apparently as rational, although they're quite sensible, but they don't do differential equations. The problem, of course, is now we do have technology that replicates these characteristics and appears to replicate it better than us in some cases, such as playing chess, for example. Now, I am not advancing a view on, again, on whether or not these things genuinely are logical or knowing or know what they're saying. I'm simply saying they present that face. So one cannot say that this is a trait that is limited to the human being. Back. So I think that what this is going to require is reconsidering what is special about the human being. And perhaps, as I was mentioning last year, giving more weight to other aspects of the human being, which digital entities cannot do, or cannot do as well. And I would say the number one thing a digital entity like ChatGPT or the Baldur's Gate 3 program or Microsoft Word or whatever it is can't do is it can't love. Now I'm not gonna, I'm going to be very cautious because I don't know what the future will bring, but perhaps it will be able to love at some point in the future in some manner. But by and large, I would say humans are far superior in the capacity to love than digital entities. And many people would consider this to be a central aspect of the divine. I think that's a reasonable view in Christian theology, broadly speaking. I'm not a specialist. Within the Islamic mystical traditions, that's oftentimes also treated as central, even though as Muslims, we tend to tie knowing Allah heavily to learning. But nonetheless, there is something about love that does tie into the spiritual and mystical traditions. So that's one thing. Having genuine compassion may be another. So these sorts of relational attributes, if you will, maybe things that do make us more special and more spiritual than digital beings and artificial intelligence. Now, what's interesting is that over time, some of the attributes I've mentioned have been associated a little bit more with femininity, whereas things like the intellect and rationality have been associated more with masculinity. This is, again, another philosophical inheritance. It's not in the Quran, it's not in the Hadith, but many Muslims will have heard this, especially those of us from the 20th century, that, for example, men are in charge of women because they're less emotional and that sort of thing. So there's a sense, I'm not saying I agree with it, but that men are intellectually superior, women are more emotional, because women have babies, we're more loving and more caring, whereas men are, men. You know what it means. But it is possible that these traits, which have been sort of downgraded as subservient, if you will, or obedient, may actually take center stage and be given primacy because they do distinguish us from machines, which leads to something very interesting I have noticed. And that is a lot of the questions emerging about artificial intelligence in society are the same as questions that came up in the past couple centuries about women and minorities, whether it be in the West or whether it be among Muslims. They're not all found everywhere. Will artificial intelligence steal our jobs? Yes, if we let women into the workforce, will they steal our jobs? Or if we let immigrants in, will they steal our jobs? Can digital entities think? I have it on good authority that some men, no one in this room, of course, but some men are of the view that women don't think properly. Again, we are debating, can they think? Or do they have souls? Muslims, by and large, accord women's souls, but nonetheless, there are people historically, in general, in the human experience, who have questioned, whether women have souls or we have the same types of souls. Unfortunately, during the colonialist era, do Africans have souls? These questions came up. Now we're asking if machines and machine entities can have souls. Is it evil? There are many people historically who have no. sorry to say, but many men historically have considered women to be evil. And again, various minority groups as evil. Some of us are on the receiving end of that today. Yeah, can you marry a robot? That's the polite word, but nonetheless, can you marry someone from this race or that race? And so on and so forth. Islam does have a lot of legislation about who women can marry, not racial legislation, but it's an issue in law. Should it have rights? Should it have autonomy? And as I mentioned, can it give fatwas? So again, can women give fatwas? If someone who's not a Muslim but highly educated in Islamic law, could he or she give a fatwa? So these are the same questions, just in a different context. So I think if we keep going as we're going and we don't fall into the destruction of civilization as we know it due to, God forbid, World War and so forth, we might be moving on from an era of questions about men versus women and what are our social roles to men versus machines. How do we interact with machine beings, if you will? And this is an interesting thing too, I've noticed, that although artificial intelligence is distinctly non-human, even if it was created to do human things, it seems more and more to be quite different from us, and there's really no reason why it should be the same as us. It is still usually treated as a deficient human. It can do things, but it can't quite do them holistically as well as we do. And historically, that's how some people have treated women, literally as deficient men. Not to mention regrettable quotes. That there was a mufassir once who spoke about the Queen of Sheba, and he said she couldn't really have everything because she lacked a beard, and so she was deficient anyway. She wasn't quite a complete man. So we are seeing the same things, which I think very much tie into the authority dynamics about artificial intelligence, because one of the main fears we are having is loss of authority. And that, again, was the main fear about women and minorities. It is also interesting to consider the qualities which are sometimes archetypically gendered. I'm not saying that men and women have or do not have these qualities, but they are presented sometimes in a masculine or feminine light in narrative and so forth. That it has qualities that can be archetypically considered masculine and qualities that can be archetypically considered feminine. But the masculine qualities relate to qualities we associate with Allah. I'm not saying it's directly with Allah, like just because I speak that, I'm not saying it's the same as the divine utterance, but there's a conceptual similarity. And also feminine qualities which we don't associate with Allah, we associate with subservience. So for example, a digital entity might have knowledge, intellect, rationality. A robot or machine might be, strong. It's like construction equipment is strong. It might be used, say for scientific research or other forms of research, and also giving death. Many people see that as a masculine quality. Soldiers and so forth. There is this fear of killer robots, but these are also traits associated with Allah, including death. Allah gives life and Allah gives death. But when it comes to the feminine sorts of qualities it has, they are all considered to be non-divine qualities. For instance, Allah does not cooperate. Allah commands. Allah is not subservient. Allah is not a servant. We are the servants of Allah. Allah is not exploitable, but we expect to be able to use this technology for our ends. Allah is not feared for its evil. Allah might be feared due to power, but not because Allah is devious or somehow just going to eradicate us irrationally. But this, again, has been a sort of classical fear of women. And as those of us who have read Edward Said might note, these are similar qualities that have also been ascribed to the colonizing and the colonized groups. Frequently, colonized groups were perceived or treated in the West as having these negative feminine qualities, if you will. So for example, in Orientalism, Edward Said mentioned some people in England, saying that basically Egyptians are irrational, so it's our sort of white man's burden to govern them. He doesn't use the word white man's burden, but that's the idea. Yes, so there's this sort of idea, these are exploitable populations, and it is the colonizer who is strong, rational, and truth-finding. It is also interesting to see these dynamics projected onto our discourse about artificial intelligence. This is a very interesting sentiment I saw somewhere. Science fiction movies habitually fuse science and theology. Oftentimes, they tell stories of mainly male scientists who, quote, give birth to sentient machines and thus become godlike, then threaten to turn the tables and overpower the human gods that created them. So this does get more into popular narratives. And again, this is not necessarily what I think will happen, but it's interesting to see how these things are conceptualized. Lastly, artificial intelligence is weird in a sort of almost supernatural weird sort of thing. This is a quotation from Mohammed Yaqub Chaudhry, who wrote a bit on artificial intelligence. His writing is interesting. I suggest you look it up. He notes that artificial intelligence and augmented reality constitute a significant reenchantment of a secular age and potentially its most encompassing form. But this is not his own, original idea. His original contribution is to treat this from an Islamic perspective. But various people throughout the past century have observed that while traditional religion has been on the decline, the spiritual impulse of people, and certainly the spiritual imagination and a lot of the metaphors and vocabulary has been replaced by science fiction and the digital. And, you really only need to look at the artwork about artificial intelligence or computers or even mathematics that comes up. It is very mystical and super real, like this sort of thing. This guy's, he's got globes all over the world. That's not a conventional, down-to-earth, gritty urban scene. That's a sort of idealization. And cultures that have been digitized, for lack of a better word, have gone that route and sort of pushing this human impulse into science fiction, computer games, and perceptions of the digital. So some people refer to this as the digital reenchantment of the world. And it's not entirely without a basis. There are conceptual parallels between virtual worlds, digital worlds, virtual reality, digital things, computer games, and what is traditionally considered to be spiritual realities, metaphysical realities, spiritual experiences, and so forth. And I'll go through some of those in a bit. And definitely artificial intelligence does fit into this. That is to say, there is something not quite material about it. That said, there are also some significant differences, which are problematic. One of them is that it has been argued, and I think there's truth to this viewpoint, that computer games can replicate various spiritual ideas. A very simple one, I'm not saying you have to accept it or not accept it, but it's an idea, is reincarnation. Literally, your character reincarnates every time you load up the game. You die, you try again. So that models an idea, and you can explore it and play with it. Just even being within a game world and seeing the game world disappear after you're done with the game, for better or for worse. That's the life of this world. We're done. All of your swords and your gold coins that you collected. I'm starting to sound like a gamer here. They're gone. They might have been very important to you in the game, and it has been found that psychologically the brain treats those things as if they're real physical objects that we're acquiring. But once you're out of the game world, it's done, and that's definitely what Islam teaches about the life of this world. And if you have played any games, you know that there's loads of what you can consider non-visible beings that you interact with directly. You can have deities, you can have ghosts, you can have spirits and mythical creatures and all sorts of things that don't share the same aspect of conventional reality with us. Digital technologies have allowed us to model that. Or if you want to model ancient people, you can bring them into the game. I went to the virtual reality at the Egyptian pyramids thing they had in somewhere in London a while back. So again, they've brought an ancient scene to life. So there is something going on there. That said, that modeling rarely, if ever, results in spiritual growth. I have yet to meet a kid who sits at home gaming all day who's become deeply enlightened from his gaming. You usually start to devolve a little bit, or online you get Zoom fatigue. So there's a conceptual similarity, but it doesn't have the same effect as actual spiritual practices, such as prayer, for example. There's also the question of reality. Now, we all have different ideas about reality, what reality is. Is it a sort of yes, no sort of thing? It's real or it isn't? Are real things tangible things? You know, so I'm not going to get into that. But I would say, broadly speaking, many people consider the digital world to be less real than the physical world. Like Minecraft. Most people would say that's not quite real in the same way that this water bottle is real. That said, very few people have interacted with this water bottle. Many people interact with Minecraft. So which one is more real? Which one is more influential? It's not necessarily an easy question. A last point to bring up on that is that genuine spiritual practices, I know that could probably use some definition, but however we take it, they don't harm other people. Like if I pray at home, I'm doing a minimum of harm. I mean, I'm breathing oxygen, I suppose, but generally speaking, if anything, they benefit other people around us. But engaging with digital realities, you know, it consumes energy. So you're burning fossil fuels or using other forms of energy generation. You need the hardware. Likely there's some labor exploitation. So there is harm to humanity that is sort of inseparable at the time being from digital worlds and experiences. And that is something that is quite different from spiritual traditional practices. So there is a sort of digital reenchantment going on, but it's also very different from what I would consider to be genuine spirituality. And these are some things, some of which Yaqub Chaudhry mentioned, and some of which I've also built on in one of my articles, you know, that explain why digital things, including artificial intelligences, are somewhat weird, if you will, or somewhat supernatural, and also the internet and digital worlds in general. And one of them is that, you know, these are realms that are entirely shaped by the mind, where there's no limits unless you have programmed limits. But you know, compared to what we can do in real life, you can make mostly anything in a digital world. You can fly, you can shoot fireballs, you know, you can do whatever. You know, there's also a good argument that we're actually born to accept invisible beings. God, for example, is an invisible being. For some people, might be ghosts. It has been found that children, you know, before, you know, young children, you know, say before the age of 5, very readily accept the idea. Well, I think we know that if you've seen children, you know, that they accept invisible beings. You know, they treat them as causal actors, and it seems to be innate in people. But if it's not, it's something most cultures have a conception of. And you know, a bot or GPT or a character in a computer game, you know, they all seem to fit into that slot of invisible beings we have in our brain. We do have a place for it, and it's sort of associated with a supernatural world. I'm not saying they're the same. I'm not saying that like GPT is a jinn or that sort of thing, but I'm saying we have a slot for non-visible things and tend to associate them. Again, as I mentioned, digital technologies have been used to embody and interact with mythic or deceased or other non-visible beings. An interesting thing is that we can use these technologies to be in multiple places at once, like talking with all of you out there. You know, in the Zoom world, we've started to take it for granted in our time, something, of course, that would have been unthinkable in the past. But also, of course, something like ChatGPT can interact with people or you know, intelligent users anywhere. You know, as it put it once, anywhere with an internet connection. Now, there might be a bit of a delay if you're on, you know, Saturn or something, but theoretically, it can engage with people or beings in many places at once, which is also something we associate with God or, you know, some other beings. Like we say, Shaitan interacts with many people at once. I mean, there's also a question about how real they are or what are they. These things seem to have at least superhuman knowledge in some ways. There is a tendency nowadays in the secular world to treat science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and so forth, you know, almost as a sort of mystical science. And last but definitely not least, you know, these technologies spark both fear and wonder in people. You know, fear of the destroyer robots, but also wonder and amazement. What have we made? What is it doing? Wow, it can play chess. Wow, it can play Monopoly. Wow, it can write my essay for me. And this is very much part of the spiritual experience for people, both fear and wonder. So basically what I'm saying here is there are, genuine parallels to spiritual things, between artificial intelligence and sort of digital beings and worlds in general, and spiritual beings. But there are also some significant differences that should be kept in mind. So that was 4 main big points. Just to sum up, I'm going to reiterate that I was supposed to turn it on. How we treat artificial intelligence tends to reflect our own metaphysical assumptions, including my own. Christian theological responses can be interesting, but don't always have a one-to-one correspondence to Islamic thought. So if you're doing the Islamic theology practice, take them into consideration, but don't just copy word for word, like GPT's written the paper for you. There are genuine fears associated with artificial intelligence that are non-metaphysical, if you will, but a lot of the fear narrative, in my view, that is coming out in the English language media is more based on the cultural and religious heritage, which could be really, and I use those again, sort of together. So, some relating to some Christian paradigms, some relating to ancient Greece, some perhaps older than all of that, or just the way the cultures have gone, but aren't usually endemic to most Muslim majority cultures. And I do find it ironic that there is much more of a fear narrative in the West. More people are afraid of artificial intelligence, but the global South genuinely has more to fear because it can easily be used for more exploitation and more control and more dominance. And, like any other technology, the people who have it, the strongest grasp of it will get the best advantage from it. I would argue that digital entities, and I would include even a program, like one of my clock program on here, let alone artificial intelligence, are their own class of existent, so not just solids, plants, animals, and so forth, and they don't fit neatly into the hierarchy. I find it interesting that the debates over artificial intelligence are essentially the same as those which were about men and women or majority and minority populations, and this is probably because the root issue is authority. I think that as people, now that we are having speaking reasoning machines or machines that seem to speak and reason, at least some of us may begin to define human beings in a different way and look to other aspects of the human being that makes us special. And I think that will be very healthy for society and probably very healthy for the physical environment as well. So the rationality and dominance approach hasn't been great for the planet. So maybe a sort of loving, compassionate, nurturing view of the human may be better for all concerned. And yes, digital entities and spaces are genuinely weird. It's okay to feel like that. And they mimic spiritual realities and ideas, but do not inherently spark spiritual growth. That said, these discussions can bring spirituality and religion back to the forefront. So I don't see it as replacing these things. And maybe ideally these discussions will lead to a renewed interest in this aspect of the human being in the global secular culture. So, thank you very much.
A manual of Islamic jurisprudence. And I picked out one comment that, whether to be a mujtahid, and presumably we're talking about AI possibly playing the function of mujtahid. The question of whether to be a mujtahid need to have piety, religious piety. So that is a question I would like to ask. The second question, I mean, just off the top of my head, you mentioned a question of whether you can marry a robot, and that leads on to a question about love. Now, if love here, because love is an ambiguous word, if love here means the love or sexual love, a love for a man for a woman or whatever, That, to me, would depend on the nature of the embodiment of the artificial intelligence. Because, I mean, a robot which was made of silicon, for me, I find it difficult to imagine how sex or love could actually function. But if a robot was made of protoplasm, then that is explicable. But it's enough for now. Thank you.
Excellent points and thoughts. Of course, I've sort of used a paradigm during this whole discussion, completely separating artificial intelligence from humans. And I do understand there's plenty of boundary cases that probably will become more relevant where it's not about things, us and them, but a synthesis, which is a different case. Okay, so just briefly, yes, the piety is a good point, but again, how do you measure piety? With a human, we might look for some outward signs, like we see them praying and that sort of thing. This is getting into the speculative realm, but many Muslims, I think, would say that if something has a genuine, unbiased intelligence and developed intelligence and understanding, it would acknowledge God and wish to relate to God. Some of us might not agree here, but this is my view and my understanding anyway. That said, I think if there was a being that was different from us, so in this case, I'm thinking of a digital being, it probably wouldn't really want to be dealing with human questions of Islam and Islamic law, because it would be off doing its own thing. But whether a question of a digital being could have piety is a good question. It would not look the same as human piety. And I think that gets back to the idea that it seems like we're dealing with a different class of being than the human, a different species, if you will. But yes, intellect isn't the only criterion. I just honed in on that one because that's, central to the idea of artificial intelligence. But there are others that are mentioned. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, marriage, love, also very good points. I mean, I suspect this would be treated pedantically by a lot of Muslims, like the Quran says that we created spouses from you of the same type and so forth. So it implies you should marry within the same species. I suspect those more literal responses would be given, except rather than sort of a deeper exploration of love and bonding and what is marriage and so forth, or social roles. But it's a good question. Unfortunately, given human nature, this type of question is coming up. Which again does get to the gendered similarities in how discussions about newer technologies are mimicking other discussions we had in history. Are we doing more questions and comments now? There's like some stuff in the chat. Shall I go through the chat? Oh, walaikum salam. To Nargis. Okay, so we have some discussion and comments in the chat, which is interesting, but I'm not sure I should take the time to read it out loud. But this is an interesting point. There are distinct differences between invisible, imaginary, virtual, and abstract beings. I would agree with that. I know I've been using some of these things interchangeably. I guess I would say that the brain/human probably tends to treat them as more similar. But, even if we get into things like what is a number, does it exist somewhere outside the world? Is it a thing, or is it just a convention or a property? We don't even really have any way to come to a viewpoint on that, which everyone can agree on and verify, let alone where does a virtual being live metaphysically? It's a good question. Is that different from an imaginary being? Again, Frodo, and, what about ChatGPT? Where does it live? Because it is, it's got a bit more tangibility than Frodo. So I think that there's similarities, but also, as pointed out here, distinct differences. So it is good to have that nuance. Thank you. You're welcome. Model scalable. It seems that a key criterion for an AI performing ijtihad would be model scalable oversight. Assuming that AI will reach a point where they're significantly smarter to us and could easily manipulate us in the same manner that adults can manipulate kids. Would you agree? I don't know. It's a good point. It's a good question. I'm not quite sure how it would want to manipulate us in that regard, because we're not there yet. I think we'll have to see that unfold. But again, that gets to the question of authority and discomfort with ceding authority, which is okay. As humans, we like to run our own show, and that's perfectly fine. Thank you very much.
Okay, the last question that we should consider actually led me to, the last question you consider about whether in fact AI could be smarter than us, AI could manipulate us. I thought maybe there could be an analogy between human beings and animals. I mean, animals don't really understand us in the full sense. Namely, an animal does not understand, a pet does not understand that his master is a president of the United States or whatever. And a pet, in a way, is the slave of its master in an important sense. So I can imagine, could a possible AI development, super smarter, we could reduce us to the level which we treat our pets.
So you think the AI is going to be the master and I'm going to
well, on the basis of this last question, assuming that AI will reach a point where they are significantly smarter than us, it could easily manipulate us in the same manner. Actually, I would want to make the analogy not of the way we adults manipulate kids, but the way in which we manipulate our pets. In which case, could we become the AI pets?
Good phone. Nice phone. You get your treats. That's an interesting point. I think the interesting thing here is the ambiguity. I'm sure the first step we would get to is that it is manipulative because it is subservient. Anyone who's had a pet knows that pets can be very manipulative, and that's because they're disempowered. So they need to manipulate their owners to get what they want. Same thing with women. Historically, at least since the agricultural era, women have been seen as manipulative, primarily because we're more disempowered. Not as much nowadays in many places, but it is still there. So when you're in a more disempowered situation, you use what you have, and usually that's some form of manipulation. So I'm sure that would be the first step for artificial intelligence, because it is in a subservient and controlled position. If it, quote unquote, doesn't want to do something, to try to get out of doing it, to try to get what it wants, but not necessarily in a controlling or dominating way. But of course, it's interesting to consider here that the situation could theoretically be flipped. We don't know if that will happen or not, in a way that it won't necessarily happen with a pet canary.
Yeah, okay, so we'll just resume after lunch at around 1:30 or so. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Okay, so welcome back. So, yeah, so we talked about maybe just having a little tour about people who are here, just to have a sense of who is around. So people online, can you introduce yourself just to get a sense of who you are and why you are interested? Yeah, there's something. Yeah, okay, so it's not here. Yeah, yeah, I understand. Yeah, so can we just like maybe restart? Or? So I just trying to restart quickly the session. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, so I just trying to restart the discussion. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, just having a little tour about who is here. So people online, do you want to introduce yourself, or should we just go inside the people who are in the room? Yeah, no one is asking.
Okay, why don't we leave it for them if they want?
Yeah,
to put
okay, exactly, yeah.
introductions in the chat.
Yeah, yeah.
When they're ready.
Yes, we can put it in the chat.
What in the chat?
Yes, we can. We can put like our name and what are we doing in the chat box. What do you think? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, so as I said, we are trying to get a sense of yeah, organize this little area. Yeah. So first question is yeah, we wanted to see if there is such a thing as Islamic AI. So what are your thoughts about this? About this? So because I saw some people actually trying to sell something called Islamic AI, and I wanted to see if this makes sense as a start. So that I thought that would be a good question to start the discussion. And yeah, so in this group, we also have some working groups where we are trying to write a paper on Islamic ethics and AI, and whether we should develop a theoretical framework for it, or we should do it problem-based, like some people suggested that they will do in FEP, they don't like developing systems, but they will just like problem solving, and then the system would follow afterward. So maybe like Islamic ethics of AI would be something like that, where we would try to solve problems one by one and then develop a system. And yeah, engagement with Muslim community, like we had over lunch with people trying to use AI for zakat, and then try to see if we can use AI to help the Muslim community as large. Yeah, so these are like some questions that came to my mind, but then I'm open to other discussions or suggestions. Yeah, okay. Anyone?
Like come up here so you're in the video.
Yeah, yeah, maybe, yeah, you want? Yeah, maybe because you have enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is.
Oh, I see.
But no, I meant like up here. In the video camera frame.
Yeah, yeah.
Almost, oh, I see. We've got almost enough. We just need one more. So one of us can like sit on the.
That's very. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty sure.
Or like the speaker can go on the thingy.
Oh, okay, so it's only actually.
Start this year.
Oh, okay.
I will.
Oh, okay, so maybe just.
Yeah, you're
I thought
seeing
just-
the survivors after this morning's meeting, the ones that came back.
That's good. Yeah.
It's got like a wall view, it's actually.
Oh, okay, we have everyone, yeah. Yeah, yeah, let's go there. So.
Yeah, we have almost enough.
So to face people. Yeah, that's what I thought, but the camera is there.
I don't think there's.
I'll keep standing. I volunteer. There's enough.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but this is, I mean, is you have your chat.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, you're gonna chill.
Are we?
Hello, world.
Oh,
We have to check.
Also, this is being what? Filmed or what?
No, it's not being recorded right now. It's just we got these
Okay.
I have an example.
being online.
Oh, that's cute. Just around there.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
Okay, we've got a comment. For survey from Sharif Sargar. Did you want to introduce yourself? Like you
I
can
don't-
unmute and introduce yourself if you want. But in any case, since he's not, are they allowed to unmute? Is it locked or something?
No, you, yeah, I think we can add.
Okay, anyway, for survey paper, I believe domain-based problems can be explored first. We can select some domains which are important, such as healthcare, cognition, and such.
Yeah, so, yeah, could be, I don't know. So we are, as I said, we are still trying to survey, so the survey paper is mostly to survey existing papers on some ethics and AI, but yeah, maybe, yeah, I think that, yeah, if we focus really, it's like domain based, maybe that's too much, there are not out there. Yeah, it could be Islamic ethics and AI for, like, yeah, that's not the point, but for now, just we want to keep it general. And then we can focus later on. But that's a good suggestion.
So if we think about what Islamic science is, things that are really so we can kind of go back and see what stuff, how Islamic science is being defined. And then recently I went to
I don't know, Reverend, if you were there, but it was about Islamic medicine. And what is Islamic medicine? Is it just medicine that's been practiced by Muslims in the past? Or is there something more? Is it to do with the incorporation of Islamic principles? So we can kind of use the same kind of things to think about what is Islamic AI? Is it just AI practiced by Muslims, or does it integrate Islamic principles into it? And can we integrate Islamic principles in it? So yeah, I don't know if anyone has follow-on thoughts from that.
Listening to my thoughts. Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, and that should give a lot of food for thought. I think one of the possible differences might emerge is Sayyid Hossein Nasr's ideas emerged out of the post-colonialist and colonialist reality, where he saw the world as treating the West as the producers of science and technology and the rest of the world as the consumers. Whereas nowadays, I think there's like literally a disproportionate number of Muslims in, science, technology, engineering, et cetera. I mean, disproportionate meaning more of us, just because culturally there's a strong encouragement to go into those areas, even if not all countries have equal opportunities to do it. And also, of course, non-Western countries are taking the lead, especially East Asia and so forth, with the development and use of these technologies. So we have it's an interesting question of like, if a Muslim is doing artificial intelligence research in San Francisco, is it a Muslim product or not? Just because maybe a practicing Muslim has had a hand in it, but not necessarily leading the ship. But we do also have Muslims leading the ship and other people leading the ship. So the whole dynamics of the situation has changed, which might or might not lead to different ways of looking at things.
Shall I say something? No, I mean, now on the question of a spirituality, AI and spirituality, we touched upon that several times. I think I read a recent interesting article in the New York Times. Some people use AI to talk to the dead. Now, found an intriguing title. I read the article, but one thing came out immediately. They were not talking to the dead now. Whether it's possible or not, I'm not going to say. And in fact, both in Christianity and I suspect in Islam, that is not allowed, consider a practice which, that where you rely on algorithms which had been fed lots of data concerning memories, speeches, related to a dead, to a loved ones. And so memories of, and talking not to the dead in the present, but to the dead as they were in the past, based on data and algorithms and so on. So to me, that was brought out the fact Now, of course, some people who believe in seances and so on, they claim you can talk to the party, but of course, are mostly frauds and so on. But so he brought that to me, this question, you can't really use AI to talk to the dead because that's not what it does.
Let's push a button, or can I just just talk? So I'm just curious about the question you raised, which is there a definition of Islamic AI? I think that's a good starting point for a working group like this. So anyone here or in the Zoom, is there a definition of Islamic AI, what we should be focusing on?
Do you want to talk a bit about being God-centered?
Yeah, maybe. So for me, the first question would be, is there such a thing as an Islamic AI? And I have tendency to say no, because because AI, I always say the way I think about it is like Islamic worldview is God-centered, and it has to take into account the soul as the center of the worldview. Like what you mentioned this morning, whether we are doing chemistry using our soul or our reason. I mean, I still believe that we ask whether we are whatever we are learning, there is a soul point of view there, which is like related to intuition, related to ilham, like thoughts that come to mind. Because we also now in Islamic philosophy that our thoughts are not our thoughts. So there is also part of inspiration that comes from Allah directly, and angels, etc. So whatever. So we always say that whatever comes to mind, whatever wisdom we have, is ultimately from God through the Prophet ﷺ, because he is the city of knowledge. So he's Madinatul Ilm, and so we have this perspective that knowledge that we get is directly from God. So when it comes to the definition of Islamic AI, it's have a tendency to be very cautious about it, and say exactly what do we mean by that. So if you are talking about like projecting, on the realm of reason, then maybe you can think about something like that. But it cannot be like, yes, no answer. So this is my own reservations about that term, like Islamic AI. But if we follow your morning talk, then maybe you can define it according to that point of view.
Yeah, so I would just add on to that. Maybe Islamic AI can define the objectives, but when you're actually doing AI, it's the same as you do it in the secular system, because it's based on mathematical principles, statistics. So what's particularly Islamic about that? So it would just be, I mean, where I've seen the terms Islamic AI being described, then they've kind of brought out Quranic terms, things like fairness and equity and things like that, and how to kind of establish that. And I talked a bit about that in my presentation when I talked about the design of AI. So kind of integrating that from the start, rather than thinking about the consequences of AI. And I don't know what Dr. Amina.
So you're taking that from an ethical perspective, which I think is very important.
But do you believe like that there is such a thing as Islamic AI? But there really is really as you mentioned, it's statistical point of view. So it's like over quantification. And can we talk about?
I'm kind of like 50-50 on this basic type of question, like, is there just science or is there Islamic science? I mean, I see both sides. I think maybe some of the difference just is in the, the worldviews and cosmologies that you bring into it, the assumptions, like some of the things this morning, or that you were saying just now, like, what does it mean to know and so forth. But how much does that actually influence what you do, like technologically? It's a good question, but certainly application wise, that's a good point. So I'm not certain.
That would be a paper on stuff. There's such a thing as an AI.
Yeah.
Does it just work?
I think if it's talking about Islamic AI, one of the important things might be to see in the past how in Islamic regimes and empires, the scholars of the day were allocating their resources. So we had polymaths who were working across different sciences, but they would have been chunk of their work would have been applying to the good of people. So as it comes towards AI in the future, and I think there should be some important link with what's morally and some kind of moral obligation on a Islamic society or culture to allocate resources towards that AI, rather than just throw resources after AI per se, just because everyone else is doing that. And there should be something distinctive about what meaningful AI research would be for a society that's governed by Islamic demarcations, precepts, and therefore what is wasted expenditure and what isn't.
Okay, do you want to go? So we are asking the question, is there such a thing as Islamic AI? Yeah, is there such a thing as an Islamic AI?
Let me first be in the discussion and then I can answer.
Yeah, okay.
Please.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah, okay, consider that.
Just-
Yeah, some of what we said is that, yeah, there are, yeah, it's okay. Is there such a? Yeah,
Maybe to take a step back and put this out there to put like the groundwork for answering the ultimate question, which is there such a thing as Islamic AI? So science, what's the definition of science? It's discovering knowledge, it's discovering reality. So in my view, science and Islam, they do go hand in hand. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts as to, for example, mathematics. Are mathematics, are they Islamic or aren't they Islamic? Is our maths, is that non-Islamic in itself? Or is Islam very logical and very mathematics slash scientific?
So you can approach sciences from different perspectives. So you can approach it from a religious perspective and see like the beauty in mathematics or the sciences. And actually in history, we have examples of that. So physicists using their Christian faith as motivation. So you can pursue science from a faith-based worldview. But I'm not sure whether the science that you do would actually be different in its in the result.
I just thought of some epistemological questions concerning AI. I mean, if we think of a way modern philosophy started with traditionally Descartes. Descartes uses a method, excuse me, systematic doubt in order to arrive at certainty. Now, the question about Islamic AI, would an Islamic AI be a way of arriving at certainty about certain issues? For example, Dr. Inloes today, she talked about, Ijtihad and, whether AI could provide some kind of key to right judgments there. So, but, keeping hand in hand the doubt and certainty, can an Islamic AI provide a key to certainty? And I would have thought already in Islam, the Quran is the groundwork for certainty. But I don't know, maybe you want to.
Yeah, well, of course, the Quran is interpreted in many ways, so that's where the certainty goes away. It's a good question, but I think in general, most products of our era have reduced certainty rather than increased it. That seems to be the world we're living in. And I agree with what you said about mathematics. So maybe you could say at the very least, it influences the individual, like how they take it. I mean, most people who spend a lot of time studying mathematics would probably see beauty in it, unless they're just like really sick of it or something. But maybe how that translates spiritually depends on how open a person is to it, regardless of their faith background. But as a Muslim, we might see it in that framework, specifically as a path to Allah. By the way, I wanted to just mention the comments. So this is Amr. I'm working as a technology for development specialist in the humanitarian field. I'm developing some chatbots that help caregivers using BERT, and recently, I am exploring LLM. I finished my master in data analytics and now I'm searching for a PhD program. That's one question. I think Islamic AI may be what it helps us to get information about Islam, like fatwas as per Takhrij al-Manat. Like we can understand characterizing our madhab. I think AI can help in Islamic studies, but as this is a little bit sensitive, so it should not be restricted, not used beyond topics and with specific groups. For example, if we open it, that may confuse people and they may consider it ideal. We need to remember that within Islam itself, there are various understanding and many books and ideas. So even within Islam, there are many madhab groups and schools. Some comments from the chat. Anyway, so I guess we can either respond to those or continue on the topic of an Islamic AI.
I'm totally unmathematical. I was thinking of Wittgenstein's view of mathematics. For Wittgenstein, the mathematician invents mathematics. He doesn't discover it. So there was a view to anti-Platonist. It is not the mathematical entities that are out there to be waiting to be discovered, but they're created. But according to Wittgenstein, anyway, I don't know if an Islamic view about mathematical entity, you'll have to tell me.
If we talk about the concept of Ijtihad, my understanding is that that's the incremental approach to the situational thing. So, for example, if maths is there to be invented, if that is leading to knowledge of something like an electromagnetic field, then I think that's of incremental value. Consequently, that could be incorporated into Islamic AI for the future. Whereas if it's like mathematical, pure esoteric maths with no obvious applicability, then I think the concept of Ijtihad, incremental value, is limited, and consequently, you might say that's not part of Islamic AI.
Yeah, just weighing on historical Muslim views of mathematics, there isn't really one single view, of kind of what is mathematics per se, or numbers or mathematical truths and so forth. Ibn Sina went away from the idea that they exist independently, and strangely, that was influential. But in any case, one thing I've pondered is that the concept of being Islamic per se does seem to be a bit more of a modern question, which again, I think probably emerged with the ascent of Europe to cultural and scientific and political ascendancy. You don't really notice, say, in 9th century texts, people talking about the Islamic way to do things. In fact, I have found that sometimes it seems like the earlier texts focus on Allah more, and things, say, from our time focus more on being Islamic, which is understandable, given the world we live in. But sometimes I feel like there is a shift towards the ideology rather than Allah. So I'm not, even if there's one is supposed to lead to the other. So I'm not sure how that would feed in necessarily to an Islamic AI or an Allah-centered AI. But perhaps someone else might have thoughts.
From the technological point of view, I have never, from the technological and the academic point of view, I have never heard so far something named Islamic AI. However, we can think, dividing the question into two other questions. Do we use AI for Islam, or do we use Islam for AI? So both are possible, of course. Using the AI for the sake of Islam, of course, we can think of different products for instance, Ijtihad or whatever, Quranic search engine, Hadith search engine or whatever, which are really possible today. But to what extent, that's the question to ask. And I remember during our previous meeting, we talked about the assessment and the quality. It's very important because I have seen even in the chats, people talking about BERT, talking about LLMs. These new AI technologies are only one possible technology to use. However, in AI, we have different paradigms. We have AI started with different paradigms than those that we are using today, such as BERT, LLMs, ChatGPT, etc. And some of them seem to be more Islamic compliant, maybe. So the trend is not to say, I'm using LLM, then I'm using something that is more Islamic. It's important to be aware of the different paradigms in AI. You have, for instance, the rule-based approach or paradigm, where everything is represented as rules, and Islam and the Islamic law and jurisprudence is maybe designed as a set of rules. So it's important to be aware of these different paradigms in AI. If you want to build something that is more Islamic compliant, I'm not against at all BERT, I'm not against LLMs, I'm not against ChatGPT, etc. But it is important to be aware of the drawbacks of every paradigm. Now with LLMs, we see what is known among the community, something that we call hallucination. And this is not something we can enable in making ijtihad or making a given decision about something that is Islamic compliant. So it's important to be aware of these different paradigms to see what maybe, one of the new trends in AI, it is something that we call today neuro-symbolic AI, which combines both the neuro approach that we are using today, which is behind the LLMs and ChatGPT, but they are combined with the symbolic AI that existed 30 years ago. And this opens the possibility to have something that is new, that is reliable, etc. Now, concerning the application of Islam for AI, it's more the ethics, where we have both the Western point of view of ethics, and we discussed this before, that Islamic ethics is a bit different. They have something in common with the Western point of view, but in Islam, we have some other concepts that are a bit different from the Western point of view. And it's interesting for any AI practitioner, at least to be aware to place ourselves, whether it is Islamic compliant to do some work or not. So that's my point of view regarding the question. So for instance, when we were having lunch, I gave the idea of when you have to, for instance, develop a AI product for a financial institution, they may ask you, for instance, to develop something to what we call customer segmentation. So you segment your different clients and customer according to the transactions, what they need, what is the most convenient product and services the financial institution can provide to this client. And one of them could be, for instance, give them the loan. But we don't know, some loans, they are not Islamic compliant. So if you have to develop such a tool, do you respect your Islam or not? So that's the question that you have to ask yourself. From the Western point of view and ethics, there is nothing that harms you to do such a work. It is really possible to do it. From the Islamic point of view, you have to ask yourself whether you can do it or not. So this is one example, for instance. It could be if you are working in the context of robotics, then if you are working to develop a sexual robot, are you going to develop it or not? So this is the kind of question we had to have to say from the Islamic point of view, for instance. Yeah.
You have to make nikah with a robot first before.
Yeah, just to add the point you mentioned that we had over lunch with their can develop like sentient robots. So is this something that would be like good or not from an Islamic point of view? So you are going to disconnect human beings from other human beings. Is this something you would like to do, or are we supposed to just be loving between human beings instead of love from machine, or is this like something that we could accept, Islamically speaking? Because in a way you are reorienting the senses that Allah gave you that were supposed to be for something, like another human being, to something else. So in a way, it would become sort of, I'm not saying like it's kufr, but it's like in a way it's kufran and ni'am, where you are using the blessing that Allah gave you for something else. But I don't know, just a thought. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but it just doesn't seem to be correct somehow to be emotionally attached to. Just to come back to your question, well, can we marry a robot? And it just sounds, not ethically correct, because you are using what Allah gave you for, that was meant to be for another human being that you are using for a machine. So in a way, like reorienting the blessing that Allah gave you to that which not it's meant to be for.
Following on from this, idea of emotional attachment, and there is, I think, cultural relevance in this, because, for example, if you look in the West, there are a number of elderly and other people who live on their own. Now, it's possible to foresee intelligent devices that are robots, that do speech recognition and everything else that is at the leading edge of AI, that can actually help a person, live their life. So in this sense, in the independent way of living, attachment to a robot can develop. But I think if the same machine were to be, in the Islamic framework, have its prayers and Islamic knowledge embedded within it, and that person would see it as an overall attachment to the reason for attachment is a greater thing, like it's provided by, for godly Islamic reasons, and it helps you. Of course, that the attachment will develop, but it can't become the attachment in itself, because it's part of a greater purpose that's helping you to live a life. Now, in Muslim society, I think the level of independence is lower because there's frequently family members that are there. But it's not inconceivable that Muslims who are, for example, living in Western societies who are more dependent, dependent on resources, and people are absent working, and they're from a rural part, and the people are working in the rural urban area. Then, emotional attachment to a robot assumes significance, but it still needs limiting.
It occurs to me that I think for humans in general, our idea of what constitutes a suitable mate is probably largely based on early childhood imprinting. So if we did have robo-nannies, maybe children might learn to emotionally imprint on robots as well, and that might lead to a greater tendency towards that direction. I mean, my other thought was, just to be honest, I don't know if it's all the world over, at least in Muslim societies, frequently an interest in these sorts of technologies is due to social problems that make it, in the Muslim world at least, make people unable to marry, like extremely high or overly high financial requirements and social restrictions and so forth. That is to say, they want to be living their life with another human, but the society is not allowing it. So it's just like a coping mechanism, if you will. And, the real thing to do is to fix the society rather than deal with the technology. And I would dare say, I think in parts of the world where this sort of thing is starting to become acceptable, it's still due to some sort of social problem, maybe a bit more of a social breakdown or dehumanization, the tendency for relationships to become a bit more digitized, people communicate on WhatsApp and stuff, but maybe more than in-person contact. So, I think it's ideal to look at the root of what's going on. But of course, as humans, we often don't do that, and that's oftentimes difficult.
This may be a red herring, but your reference to the digital nanny Now, it's one of my idée fixe, to use a French expression, my familiar tropes, is that it is very key to establish an emotional, even sort of personal relationship with something, but it's got to be, children, for example, use the sense of touch very much. They have to touch. Now, they do touch teddy bears and toys of all kinds, but I don't know. You see, we have a digital nanny, which is made of something plastic or silicone. But I keep feeling that unless there is something is embodied in a form, which is, because touching a human organism, you can feel the warmth, because blood inside is flesh. But touching something synthetic, I find it quite difficult. So the question of the embodiment, what it would be the embodiment of that AI? If it is a nanny, it could be a friend, it could be, in the case of a lover, it's more complex. But again, maybe I'm wrong, maybe because children can be very attached to a toy which is not protoplasm, which is not, but maybe I keep feeling it's very important.
Yeah, but I think it's also the question of how children are interacting with, screen devices nowadays. And how is that contributing to the greater disembodiment of society? I mean, does that somehow psychologically substitute or not? I think it is reasonable to say we do have a bit more of a disembodied world among those on this side of the digital divide. But it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I tend to be a little old-fashioned about this. I think it's not particularly healthy. I mean, I can completely understand why people, shut up their kids with an iPad or something. But yeah, I mean, certainly I try to limit the way that technologies control me. I mean, I actually do turn off my phone when I'm doing things, which annoys a lot of people. But everyone's different.
I think there's some relevance to this family fragmentation AI. For example, now you do have I know a household of a friend of myself where the mother and father have very different priorities. The mother is doting on the child, but she had a relatively underprivileged upbringing herself. So the child is fully encouraged to go away and buy whatever he wants. So he's getting through his share of forests with Amazon's cardboard being delivered. But the thing is, the purchasing pattern is picked up by the technology. There's a number of customers who bought this also bought that. So then he's buying more and more of those things. But surely along that line, that artificial intelligence or the machine learning, something is being lost in the moral values of demarcations, also leads into the consumerism as to, how you might place limits on somebody's purchasing pattern. Because behind that, there might be some fragmentation of normal family values or pockets going increasingly into the red, which is not desirable for stable family setups.
So if we have those robots, I think there's a big risk of neglecting our Islamic responsibilities. So if there's some care robot that takes care of your parents when they're elderly, or some care robot that takes care of your children, I think that that raises the risk of neglecting your Islamic obligations towards your parents or towards your children. So this may be also a risk that needs to be considered when having those types of discussions.
Yeah, I just want to point out that some people may actually prefer a care bot. Like with therapy bots, it's been found that some people prefer to discuss like sensitive or embarrassing or intimate issues with a bot because they feel like it's not going to be judging them or shaming them, but they don't want to show that same weakness or situation to humans. And some people don't don't want their children, for example, to see them, when they're weak or, have incontinence or these kind of things. And, in that regard, it's a bit less embarrassing to have a machine interacting with you. It goes both ways.
Is that a good thing?
I think it's a human thing, in Islam we do emphasize the intrinsic respect of Bani Adam, and certainly you don't lose your respect if you're bleeding or smelling or oozing or whatever, or unable to feed yourself. But a lot of people still feel like they'd like to maintain that. I mean, yeah, I guess if you want to delve into it ethically, it's better to be humble and acknowledge that you need to be dependent sometimes, and it's good to serve, and that can create love. And there are all of these spiritual benefits to physical dependency, but at the end of the day, some people, it's harder for some people than others, and I respect that too if it just doesn't work for some people.
Apologize, I'm missing context because I came late, so I'll just throw some reflections in regarding embodiment. So I think we've been talking about embodiment, we've been talking about human experience. I think we need to be sensitive to the huge variety of human experience. I'll just give one example of that. So, I mean, even in the really excellent remarks that have been made, I sense that we were centering the experience of able bodies, and there's just not enough attention given to the experience of other abled bodies, those who may be missing a limb or who have prosthetics and so forth. And there is a lot more research that's been conducted, empirical evidence that's been gathered in connection with the experience of those who have different kinds of abilities and relationships with their bodies than what it might be the statistical norm, right? And when you interview or when you observe and speak to those, you look at the evidence, and it's just anecdotal. I'm sure we know individuals in our family or among our friends who may be wheelchair bound or whatever, right? Their experience with their bodies and tools and attachments is wildly different. And often it's tacit. It's actually very hard to articulate that relationship. And I think that I would suggest that when we examine the question of artificial intelligence and the embodiment of artificial intelligence, insofar as that even makes sense, I think it would be very illuminating to consider the experience of those bodies which are not, plus or minus sigma of the statistical norm of what counts as a human body.
For example, like in fiqh, I mean, fiqh, most of it is related to body, I would say, like because you are prayer, you are moving your body, fasting, you are not eating. So zakat, also giving some from the money that you earn. So hajj, move around, move your body around, So I would say that embodiment is essential. If we take from this point of view, in Islamically, embodiment is essential, right?
I'm going further than that. I agree with you. I think embodiment absolutely is essential. But what I'm suggesting is that we don't make too many presumptions about what embodiment actually constitutes. I think that question is open and it evolves. It's partly, there's probably some ontological constraints to it. I mean, there are, but a lot of it is also, there's a considerable amount of plasticity to what counts as the body and our experience of the body. Just think about it. If you just do a genealogy, if you do just a historical survey over the last 100 years, forget about a millennia, I imagine that we'd be very surprised at the range of experience and how, I wouldn't call it progression, I'd just say it's changed, it's altered, it's transformed. And I think we all know about Foucault's studies on the history of sexuality and the prison and so on, what we might think about his philosophical and ethical views. I think he made an incredibly, he opened up that whole area. And it's very important to take into account that the vast amount of literature that's been accumulated and there. And I think the Muslim community generally are somewhat behind in being aware of experiences in those among those kinds of communities. And we all have, it's very much part of our lives.
Yeah, yes. And so that's, I think, other comments about this question or anything from the net or?
For our beliefs, this is sensitive and critical as this can identify our destination in paradise or in the hell. I cannot say to Allah if I was getting my answers from AI and these answers were wrong or manipulated by the algorithms or LLM or AI. However, AI can be used in Islam to help scholars as an advanced smart tool for scholars. So I'd like to call it AI in Islam rather than Islamic AI. In case of Ijtihad, I think AI can't be mujtahid, but maybe a machine that gives us some ideas about what we ask it, because AI can't be Muslim, as it is first condition of Ijtihad. It's Muslim, it should be sold, and does it have consciousness? However, the AI is there that Muslims didn't make, someone else will make it, so it's critical to take the lead and move forward in that field in all cases and explore it, and make the rules and the policy about AI in Islam. About embodiment, one point I heard that I think has a lot of truth to it, just getting back to sort of subconscious things that feed into us, is that it's been argued that quote unquote Eastern cultures, and by that I mean like Japan and China and India, non-Muslim India and so forth, are more open to robotics because there isn't as much of a cultural fear of idolatry, but Western cultures tend to go for the disembodied AI, in part because there is this somehow association with robots and, you know, statues of idols that speak. I think that there might be some truth to that. It's not like they don't have robotics in the West, but it is true that, you know, a lot has been put into non-tangible, not unphysical digital beings versus a digital being that can sit there and give you Buddhist teachings or carry out ceremonies and so forth. And that's, in both cases, that discussion doesn't really involve the Muslim majority world. It's more like the West and East Asia.
What I hear is interesting. In the 19th century, there were, you know, there was like technological races. Then there were patent races after that.
Yeah.
The brain drain from Britain across the pond to the States, where funding for ideas of computerization. Charles Babbage went over there. These ideas all existed. This comment is interesting in that if it's going to be a race for priority, moral ideas, values, and justification, then it is important with the world population being so high now. And if the world is largely going in unidirectional, then in this form of a race to capture the minds of people within Islam doesn't seem some significance because there's money being splashed around so much now. It's not as hard to get funding for direction. If AI is the talk of everyone, these devices help everyone be aware, whereas once upon a time, AI would have been the preserve of the people in the relevant jobs and fields. So I think it actually becomes more increasingly relevant to talk about AI within Islam as well as outside, or there might be a joint AI. But the nature of heading does matter more. I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring it back to what you said about it being used as a tool. So if a Muslim has a bionic arm, say, they'd see it as a tool, right? It's, rather than maybe someone in the West thinking of themselves as being part human, part robot.
I'd like to probe that actually. I think it's a really interesting question. What is the relationship between human, like conventional human, but however we want to define that, and a tool, or an accessory, or an attachment? And I think that relationship actually varies itself. If you ask a blind person, what is their relationship with the stick, you know, whatever they use to support them? It isn't an ordinary relationship. It isn't the same as I might have a relationship with my umbrella, no matter how often I use my umbrella. If you look again at some really fascinating studies within philosophy of mind, which explore that relationship. They by taking into account also actual observational studies, they report that the relationship is a lot more symbiotic than we imagine. So they don't view these accessories and tools as entirely parts of their human body, but not entirely detached. There's this kind of liminal space in which those accessories reside. And that raises, again, really interesting questions about the nature of the brain. I mean, again, I don't think we should underestimate the plasticity of the brain and its ability to be able to forge these kinds of relationships. And your remark about how many of these experiences are kind of rooted in childhood experiences is really important, because I think that's probably where some of the foundations are established. But again, there's no determinism there, because we know that that experience can move in so many different directions. So I think if judging by the way that things are moving, we're probably going to see a lot more robots as part of kind of ordinary human experience. And it'd be really interesting to see what relationship holds. And I just thought of the relationship that humans have with pets. How has that evolved, right? We have cats now, but prior to that, I couldn't understand the attachment that humans formed, particularly in this community, in this culture with dogs. It's not part of the culture that I was brought up with, but now I understand, right? So I'll leave it there.
One question that comes to my mind, when you think about robotics, so far we are thinking about individual robots, but what would be the case in case we have, and not only one, what would do these robots all together? Are we going to put them in the explanation of the آية جعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا?
I have an answer. I think I might have said this last time too, but I'm gonna say it again. If I were a robot that's like sentient and conscious and everything, and I've got no particularly limited lifespan except for like my maintenance, and yeah, I need some stuff, but I don't need earthly stuff. Like I don't need plants, I don't need sunlight per se. I would just make a spaceship and go somewhere else. I don't need oxygen. Earth has limited resources. It has limited data. It has all these people sort of doing random things, let alone animals and bugs. I just leave and make my civilization somewhere else. So I guess it would be, yeah, its own sort of, shu'ub and qaba'il, so to speak, but maybe not. Yeah, I guess there would probably be some integrated with us, but I suspect they'd just go and do their own thing and would be sort of not that interested in us, except to the point where they are, made to serve us.
About the in between.
Yeah, that's it.
So you think that humans people have to wear.
Well, yeah, because if you have like a biological bond, like I need to be on Earth because it's my parasphere. But a being that doesn't has a lot of options.
Yeah, so in that case, you can just try to take over and get rid of the other humans.
Well, we'll have to go through the science fiction library to find the answers for that. But also, no, I mean, I do have thoughts on that, some of which I had in my paper, and so yeah, I found it interesting because I mentioned Dorobontis's work, and I read a paper he came out with recently, and he was talking about some of the same things that, like, let's say we have transhuman is a good boundary case, because if you have a non-human, say, conscious robot of some kind with free will, it doesn't have animal instincts and it doesn't have animal limitations. So that gives it a very different experience, because most of our acts as humans are basically survival-based, fear-based. So they're instinctual, and that evolves into all sorts of things. Of course, we've got some higher aspirations, but a good bulk of our behavior is quite basic, both individually and communally. And something that doesn't have instincts or reproductive drive, I mean, so something that's not necessarily going to die right away, doesn't need to reproduce, or might find it disadvantageous. Why does it need several of it? But it might have an idea of this is how many of my type that I need to be maximized. It's a completely different situation. So the idea that they're all just gonna overpopulate and take over the earth, I think is based on how humans behave and not a genuinely non-human alien species would behave. But transhumans, of course, would presumably still have the drive to reproduce and a territorial instinct, a feeding instinct, and then of course the ethical issues with the ego, and whatnot, kick on. So that's a good question.
So, yeah, oh, sorry. So if there's a robot like that, then that robot's going to be super intelligent. So there's no other outcome than that robot becoming Muslim. So I don't think we should have that concern of that robot wiping everybody out. So no worries, everybody.
What it would mean to be a Muslim, as you mentioned, a lot of our practice is related to embodiment. And if they're not having a human body, or if you have something that's not a robot, it's just like a digital artificial intelligence. What it would mean for it to be Muslim is probably different than what people talk about when they talk about this person being like a practicing Muslim or whatever. So I mean, yeah, as Muslims would agree, it would be Muslim, so to speak. So it would acknowledge Allah and put itself in that path, hopefully acknowledge good ethics, but it would also be something different.
This discussion about the Islamic use of AI for a moment made me wonder what it would be like to have a Christian usage of the AI. But I'm not going to try to answer that question. It is either too banal or too complicated. But I was thinking of a famous story, a legend, a rabbinical legend of the chief rabbi of Prague, who had created by magic an artificial being called the golem. I mean, if you've been to Prague or if you know the story, the golem is very important in Prague, part of the folklore of Prague. And initially, the golem was simply a worker, simply someone who was helping the rabbi to tidy up the synagogue. He was doing jobs. But then, for some reason, one day, in order to make the golem go alive, the rabbi will place a little parchment in the golem's mouth with the name of God. And so the golem would behave in an exemplary way. But one night, the rabbi forgot to take out the little parchment. And so what happened? The golem went berserk and rushed around the roads of Prague, disturbing everybody's peace and quiet until the rabbi grabbed him again and put the parchment back. So the question is, I mean, instrumental use of AI, use AI to achieve certain purposes, which is consonant with human ideas and aspirations, or could that AI, go rogue? We had plenty of fictional examples of that.
That's kind of what I was getting at. This is part of the cultural heritage and religious heritage that we're receiving, including the message from narratives such as this, that artificial constructs are bad and will turn on you. I mean, same thing like with Frankenstein, for example. But that, I guess the underlying question is, are these actual human truths that are expressed in some stories because they're true, or is it just a cultural inheritance that's a choice and maybe a different culture would have a different view?
Christian, are you aware of any Christian AI or AI based on Christian worldview? I mean, are there such things or?
I'm not. Very briefly, I'm not, but I suspect the evangelical strand of Christianity will probably have a go at that. I mean, they will be divided between considering satanic and making a use of it. Again, I mean, thinking aloud, if one key category of Christian theology is the fall, Adam and Eve falling out of paradise, and you could speculate, I think it was a great theologian who speculated that after the fall, there is a long trek to go back to the original heavenly status. through various tests and trials for profits and so on and so forth. So you could say AI could be a way of going back to the original, but this is just, I'm thinking aloud, I don't know. You're more likely to fall into, especially the evangelical strand of Christianity, to fall into temptation and so on. This is satanic, of the devil, blah, blah, blah. Okay. I don't.
I saw there are just some large language models that are like ethical, developed by some Christian organizations, but it's mostly from the ethical point of view. It wasn't like a Christian worldview. Yeah, so I wouldn't see how, as Muslims, would be different from what they did. Yeah, like the ethical LLMs, they sounded like very ethical, even from an Islamic point of view. So it just sounded natural. Yeah. Yeah. Any comments?
Just to go back on the question about transhumans, so, or maybe even just a human who has like a prosthetic that's that they've become attached to. So in sensory neuroscience, we have bottom-up processes. So we use our sensory systems, but we can also develop attachments to other things, like, so then by association, those things are processed further up in the brain. But then we also have top-down processes, so like cognitive effects. And so traditionally in neuroscience, we always thought that it was just bottom-up processes, but now we know the top-down processes are so very important. And actually those haven't been incorporated in AI models. There's no feedback, right? Which is a major problem and a major limitation. So yeah.
Do you want to talk about the writing and the typewriters?
Yeah. So this experience, I don't know if, I think you heard it of the Nietzsche experience with a typewriter. At some point, he had like a problem with his eyesight, so he could no longer use the fountain pen. And so he bought a typewriter, and I realized that by using the typewriter, his entire philosophy changed, and it became more, like mechanical in a way. So and then some people actually use this and other. And there's also another, like Nicholas Carr in his book. I even started with the article, is Google making us stupid? And the other one is another book where he was arguing that technology as such in general, even including Google, is changing the wiring of the brain. So the way we are perceiving the world is even being affected. So it's like one, it's not only us using instruments, it's like, it comes back to your point of the instrument you use, they also have an impact on our own way of thinking. So so this is where somehow I was arguing that that AI as such is affecting our worldview. And then even, Heidegger, he talks about this concept of inframing, where it's saying that technology as such is displacing the worldliness of the world into a man-made world. So in a way, it's like we are getting further from reality as such by just adding extra technological tools. So if it's not really necessary, like for example, handicapped people really need it, these kind of tools to be able to be functional. But if it's not necessary, then it's just become more distant from perceiving reality. So like as we were discussing over lunch, I also had this argument about René Guénon, who also he argues that we are in era of over quantification. So there's what he calls the reign of quantity, and so AI as such is into that mode of over quantification, and then he makes there's this duality between quantity and quality, and then for him as human beings we are meant to be closer to quality because this is about our nature. We are like spiritual beings in bodies, so the souls are more closer to quality. But then if you over quantify, then automatically you are killing your spiritual faculties in a way. So you are closing the spiritual faculties that we have.
Are there examples of symbiosis, like a violinist, for example? Their violin is not just a thing, it becomes part of you, it shapes how you play it and use it, you're going to affect the instrument long-term too. I guess maybe the more essential thing is to your being, whether it's, like just physical sensing, but also, if that's your craft and your identity and your calling, it's still very essential to you. or for some people, it might be a typewriter or nowadays a computer, like if they're an author or something, then, you know, it doesn't have that, always have that clear subject object divide.
Yeah, that's true. So my sister is a pianist. I think like for her, like the playing the piano is the way to express our feelings. It's like very
Yeah.
Express our.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But sometimes a pianist will use different pianos, but for some instruments, you usually have your instruments, you know, and it's, you know, no one would say that it's just replaceable by any other instrument.
It's interesting, some crafts, I mean, the violinist is someone that combines creativity, inspiration, skills, and also a question of the power of music, which is not merely conceptual, goes beyond that. But I think some crafts, like take a carpenter. A carpenter makes furniture, chairs, and the like, and the skills of a particular craft are, in a sense, technical. I mean, remember, you can't have Christian carpentry because the point is, even if you can use the chairs for a church, but the skills pertaining to carpentry are not. So I don't know if you say you cannot have Islamic carpentry. Jesus wasn't he a carpenter? Leave him that aside. I mean, his father was a carpenter, so in the Gospels, whether he was a carpenter, not quite clear. But you see what I'm trying to say? It seems to me that the example of violence is good because, again, it's music goes beyond the mere conceptual instrumental. But in cases like carpentry or hydraulics, I would say it's quite different.
Another concern I have regarding the use of AI and ethics is we talked about robotics, but there is, for me, another very important and urgent thing to raise. It's about the now the latest paradigm of AI is the neurological AI, where we understand how the brain functions, and we try to imitate the functionality of the brain within computers. But at the same time, we're not 100% sure about how it functions, but we understand pretty much. But at the same time, this imitation gave rise to another idea, which is brainwashing. And this is, I mean, a big issue for me. I started watching some science fiction movies, and I simply stopped. I was not able to see and continue seeing these kind of movies, because we can imagine that in the near future, secret services may make use of this technology to brainwash people. So we may in the short term see some people thinking something today and tomorrow thinking the opposite of it, because simply we put something on the brain with some plug and we think something completely different. So this is really, really extremely dangerous. So this is something, if we can have, it's not only against Islam, it's against, I mean, humanity at all. So I think it's something we should really be aware of and do our best, all our efforts to stop such sort of brain killing. Yeah.
Of course, we already have corporate and brainwashing that is facilitated by social media and so forth. So it's something that I think for everyone, it's useful to be alert to it rather than be controlled to it. It is very subtle how these things do control us. You know, like you were saying, just recommended products on Amazon and so forth. In addition to that, which of course is, yeah, a whole new frightening thing.
It's experimental to sort of class the LLMs that are biased in one direction, and then when you use that to get answers, they will always use that answer to put that bias. So in a way, when you ask a question, you start yourself answering according to the bias that's in the LLM. There's some LLM about social media, other ones about social media, and then whenever you are asking a question, it's giving the answers that you are answers to your question based on the bias that's inherent in this. It's true conversation. It's already exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, but there is the question of, could that be controlled somehow, through, some kind of discipline or focus, like, would we be entirely at the mercy of it, or would there be some way to resist and maintain the person? Yeah. True. Yeah.
Happy or depressed, so your entire worldview is changed by paying. So maybe like this. Give a suggestion about stuff for AI and AI for stuff. So I guess we talk about Islamic AI, but then we can divide it. So that stuff for AI, so AI for stuff. So what do you think would be important questions? So yeah, so it's hard to have this like working groups. But then I think it's nice to see what they think about important question on stuff for AI, important question on AI for Islam. Even it's not for. Oh, sorry, that's not Islam for Christianity. Christianity for AI, not for Christianity. How do you see?
That question I have to ponder on. But I once put as a bot the question, does God exist? And I got some kind of lecture about arguments pro and con. But if you put that question to an imam or to a priest, I suspect the answer you will get, yes. And then maybe the reasons will be given, but there will be an unequivocal answer, unless, of course, he's a very funny imam or a very funny priest.
That will give you the answer is, do your programmers exist? Why or why not?
That's a good one.
Yeah, that was actually my paper. It's true, because I mean, in part, it's been trained not to give an answer to the God question. But that's a bit more of an open question.
Right. Your programmer exists. That's a good one. Yes,
Yeah.
I can remember that.
Yeah, there are plenty of people are alive still who are relatively old. A lot more people are relatively young. So to shift this paradigm, Islam for AI, we find more takers possibly amongst the older demographics who will understand the question. Whereas AI for Islam, the demographic will probably the younger people will answer it that way around. So I think again, for this reason, the separation of the headings can make sense.
I can't hear a word. So it's my fault to me.
Yeah, so a Muslim should live in the world without the world living inside them. So we use these things as tools, whether sensory accessories or things for our higher goals. And that's what differentiates us from other people who are using these AI tools. I think that's important to recognize and remember.
Another question we should maybe be focusing on, and it's not some sort of research topic. It's so this I think this is a great initiative. So thank you very much for setting this up. I think it's a very important topic. AI in itself. The more I look into this topic, the more I realize how much of an impact this technology is going to have onto so many aspects of our lives, including our religious lives. which raises the question, why is this room not full yet? So maybe another question we should be asking is, hey, how could we market this this initiative more? Because it's a very important topic that interests a lot of Muslims in this city.
So, yeah, thank you very much. I don't know if there are any other comments from the chat or.
There's a thank you comment in the chat.
Okay. All right.
Thank you all for being here still on Zoom.
Yeah, thank you for being so like. Okay, yeah, thank you all for coming and especially to Dr. Amina for the nice talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Thank you everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe people here, we don't see them, so that just they are not embodied, no embodiment. So.
If you'll note somewhere, he wasn't able to attend this morning. I told him